Hi, it's Mark Bernard, and I'm here to speak to you about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework from the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity Excellence. Today we're going to talk about the first lesson of 23 lessons, and that lesson is situated in the first course under Identify. There we go. I use a reference model to provide a visualization of the 5 different domains: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and to put them into some kind of context in a one-page visualization. Obviously, detect is there to monitor and to alert us to any sort of security events or incidents that are occurring. Protect is the module that we use to lay down the security controls within the environment. And respond, of course, is the first step in the incident handling practice. And then, of course, recovery. Identify sits at the top because it manages the governance in the risk management framework as well as supply chain. But today, we're going to be talking about asset management. Asset management is so fundamental in the beginning of every security program that it needs to be done as soon as possible. And usually when I build frameworks, there's 3 things that are top priority for me: the governance, setting up a committee to review and help steer the project, as well as the risk management policy and framework. It needs to be approved before we can start executing it. And then the next thing we need is the asset management. We need to understand what assets are in scope. And during these 23 lessons, we're going to talk more about asset management. During each lesson, I'm going to take you from just simply being informed about what the NIST Cybersecurity Framework lesson is about to giving you a deeper understanding of what the subject matter is and what it contains. And hopefully that will put you in a position where you can leverage this knowledge in your day-to-day work. And that's my goal, is to give you some knowledge that you can use either to get a job in a NIST cybersecurity environment, or perhaps if you're already leading an environment, that this will help clarify some of the issues that you're dealing with. Beyond this, of course, as you grow in your knowledge and practice of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, you'll learn how to troubleshoot problems with the framework. You'll also learn how to do audits against the framework, and you'll become an architect eventually. You'll be able to design the NIST Cybersecurity Framework to fit into whatever business it is that you're working in. It could be in government or in the commercial sector. Now, each of the lessons have a number of goals that we're trying to achieve. Okay, they're listed in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So the first one here for asset management is to ensure that all physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. So we need to try and achieve that. We also need to look at software platforms and applications within the organization and make sure that they are also inventoried. And goal number 3, the organizational communication and data flows are mapped. And this can be challenging because this is a big to-do if you haven't already done it. And of course, 4, external information systems are cataloged. So if you're using cloud services, for instance, you need to know what systems your data is sitting on. And 5, resources. So other types of resources. So hardware devices, personnel, software, they need to be prioritized based on the classification and criticality and business value. And this is part of the risk assessment process that helps you to identify the criticality of systems. And 6, cybersecurity roles and responsibilities for the entire workforce and third-party stakeholders are documented and established and communicated. And this is important to know where the handoffs are between the different teams. So it's always a good idea to document the workflow and share the workflow with the various teams so that you have a good idea of when you're expected to step up and take care of a task, or when you should be handing it off to somebody else. So a lot of times we use things like RACI charts to explain roles and responsibilities. Now, one of the things that I've tried to do in the lesson to make the knowledge transfer a little smoother is I've tried to come up with some questions about the 6 goals in this case. So for instance, how many of you have created a list of physical devices or software applications within the organization? You may have already attempted this. I know some organizations that have attempted it many, many times and failed, and others that have never done it before. So being able to quantify how many physical devices you have and what kind of software you're running is very important to provide any type of resilience and being able to block vulnerabilities and threats. Can you describe the telecommunication data flows within your infrastructure? A lot of times the answer is no, because data flows are not easy to map, and usually you need the engineers to help you with that. Please describe your external information systems. A lot of times people hear the word external information systems and they're puzzled because they're not sure what that actually means. But what we're talking about are the cloud systems, for instance, or any other systems that you might be leasing or using to process your company's information or your customer information on. So we need to know what those systems are. And why? Because we need to treat or monitor the vulnerabilities associated with that and make sure that they're addressed. Have you classified your network resources based on criticality or business value? So this is important. This should be a step in your risk assessment process, and it's something that the governance committee would decide upon. How do you differentiate between cybersecurity roles and the roles of third-party providers, service providers? Well, that's a very important question because a lot of times we outsource different parts of our business and services to get help, specialized help in some cases from external parties, but we never clearly document what it is that they're supposed to be doing for us. So it's important, especially when it comes to roles and responsibilities, so that we know where the handoff is between the various groups. Let's talk about assets. Obviously, the most important asset that we have is data or information. We have databases all over our organization used for many different purposes in order to help the business or help the government organization function. And of course, the second most important asset will be people. We need people because they bring skills to our company. They bring knowledge to our organization. They develop knowledge while they're with our organization. So people are very important assets. Without people, the organization would probably fail. And we need software. So we need software to access the data and help us to leverage the data for the goals and the objectives of the organization in order to achieve those goals. Software is everywhere, and software generally is used at different levels within the organization. So we have like enterprise class software, and then we have productivity class type software. So we have enterprise resource planning systems, and we have Microsoft and other types of tools that we use to write reports and produce documentation and etc. so forth. And then of course, behind the data and the people and the software would be the hardware. So we have servers, we have racks, we have smartphones, laptops, tablets, we have desktops, lots of hardware everywhere around the organization. This information, these assets are all encapsulated or organized within the organization on the network within parameters, secure parameters, some people refer to them, or security zones within the organization. A security zone may be built around different parts of the business. For instance, the finance organization may have a security zone, or the IT area may have a security zone. And of course, there's external service providers that also have their own security zones. So this involves the telecommunication assets and how we configure the telecommunication assets. We're going to be talking more about that very shortly. Telecom assets are things like firewalls, routers, switches, load balancers, that type of infrastructure. If you're not familiar with these types of devices, you should do some research and learn about them more because they're vital in how we share data and process it. And then we have physical parameters. So we have buildings, we have warehouses, we have a head office. We even have home offices. When people are working from home during, for instance, the pandemic, their office becomes a secure parameter for business to be conducted inside. We have third parties who have secure parameters. So these are the 6 assets that we have within our organization. Again, data or information, people, software, hardware, telecom, and facilities. And you'll find out why this is important because coming up very soon, we're going to be doing a risk assessment. And when we do the risk assessment, we're going to be looking at the assets. Again, people. So for instance, engineers, warehouse accountants, salespeople, employees, managers, executives. Information. We have operational type information, business information, customer information, strategic plans, financial data, sales data, transaction data, audit logs. These are just examples to give you some ideas of the type of assets that I'm talking about. We have software. We have computer operating systems, utility programs, productivity tools, enterprise systems, antivirus. Under hardware, we have desktops, laptops, tablets, smartphones, servers, monitors, the CCTV or closed circuit television system that we use, also the access control system that we use, and also the intrusion prevention system. These are all examples of different types of hardware and systems that we have. And the reason why IPS and access control and CCTV are listed under hardware, although they run on software, is because a lot of times these are on customized applications appliances that we plug into the racks or that we might have in a separate room somewhere within the facility, a security room. Telecommunications includes firewalls, switches, routers, load balancers, protocols, cabling, fiber, microwave, dishes, etc. And of course, facilities are pretty straightforward. Physical security has often been easily recognized in traditional security settings. But of course, lately, with the eruption of the cloud computing and all the various cloud apps that we have now, the physical security parameter is pretty much dissolved, and we need to establish security thinking on a much bigger scale, on a cybersecurity scale. Okay, my first question was, how many of you have created a list of physical devices or software applications within your organization? Well, here's some tips on where to look. So, physical devices, that could be any device or software accessing information from your organization. They need to be included. Also, assets need to be managed from cradle to grave in secure organizations. Now, that means that you need to have something like a configuration management database where when you purchase an asset, it gets registered in the database, and every time there's a patch or it gets repaired or something happens to it, gets modified in any way, there's a record of what happens to it in the CMDB. The most effective way to manage assets is to automate the lifecycle by creating and maintaining a database, as I mentioned, this CMDB. ITL framework or ISO 20000 uses configuration management databases. So if you're familiar with ITIL, you'll know all about CMDBs. If you're not familiar with the CMDB, you might want to research ITIL and see how they use it. Asset vulnerabilities are best managed when grouped into 6 categories. So that's why we have the 6 categories of assets, because people all have a common vulnerabilities and threats. So if we fix the vulnerability or risk mitigate a vulnerability associated with people, then we generally fix it for all the people in the organization. The same with information. If we patch or fix something on a database management system, for instance, generally it helps all the data that's being managed through that database management system. Software, the same applies. So when we fix the vulnerability in one place, it has residual benefits. So the best way to manage vulnerabilities is to try and group them into these classifications so that we can kind of streamline and maybe even orchestrate a little bit the way that we handle assets. The investment in security cannot exceed the asset value. This is a principle that we've used for a long time. So in many organizations, security is always looked as a black hole. But in more modern organizations, we have to justify the cost for implementing security controls. And it should never exceed the value. So the first step would be, once you create your asset inventory and you identify all your information assets, is that you conduct some kind of evaluation process so that you determine what is the value of that asset to the organization. And then whenever you do a risk assessment and suggest to have controls implemented, you look at the value of the asset and make a decision, or you bring it to the governance committee and they make the decision for you. Okay, second question. Can you describe the telecommunication and data flows of your infrastructure? Most people can't. This is something that's really important, especially with the concerns around privacy and the GDPR. Mapping the data flows of customer data is very important. In some organizations, I've seen data flows ping pong around the infrastructure as many as 23 hops. And what that means is just like it sounds. So imagine it. The data packet is hopping from, a load balancer to a firewall, back to maybe a server or a proxy server, and then over to another server to be authenticated. So it can ping pong around the organization. So don't be surprised how many hops you find when you start to map your data flows. Now you need to know where your data has been archived and is processed. So mapping the data flows is very important, especially if you're concerned with privacy and the protection of information. You want to know what device your data is passing through, because if you miss one device, that might be the device where it's being intercepted at, and you don't want that. The data is transmitted in packets using things like TCP protocols. These packets will bounce or hop around the organization, depending on the IP address and physical cabling. Telecommunication equipment includes routers, switches, load balancers, firewalls, IPS, specialized equipment that performs specific tasks while handling the packets. So you want to know what those devices are. And probably when you map the data flow, you'll find out what they are. The organization's network engineers or architects can create a network diagram for you. And that's usually the first step. So once you have the diagram and you have the various infrastructure components, such as the firewall, the routers, load balancers, any switches and servers laid out, then you can, take another slice off the onion or peel another layer off the onion and go a little bit deeper and find out where the data is going within those devices. You need to identify technology has been implemented to understand the data flows. So you need to understand, are we using encryption? Are we using natting? Do we mirror data? Because that means we're making duplicate copies of it. Is it a high availability network? So that means that if one line fails, another line takes over, right? Are we using the cloud? How about IPv4 or IPv6? Because those provide some additional security features such as encapsulation. They encrypt the little packets. So even though they're traveling across the network, nobody can really intercept them. You can trace data flows using commands like ping, trace packets, trace routes, or packet sniffing technology like Wireshark. 3, describe your external information systems. If your organization uses cloud computing, you have external systems. Does the organization's information architecture use a distributed database management system? So in some applications, depending on what application technology you're using, it may use distributed database architecture. And what that means is that it might break the information up into chunks and store it in different locations on the network within the application. So that's something that you need to understand. You need to drill down into, find out what is the database system that you're using. Is it a DB4, DB3? Is it distributed? Does the organization have branches, divisions, or satellite offices that run servers that compile batch data and transfer data on a daily basis? This happens in a lot of organizations, especially when it's a global organization and you have offices in Europe or in Africa or in Asia. A lot of times they will compile data and then they will fire it off during the evenings or at the end of the day when it's done processing, and they'll centralize it into one database or into one application. It might be hosted on the cloud. It might be hosted in a head office somewhere, maybe in North America. But these batch jobs gather transactions and different types of activity, and then they send them off together So you might want to find out if that's true, if that happens. It's a good question to ask. Do we have servers running in offices, and do they batch data and then transfer it? Does the organization have multiple locations around the globe or the country? Because this might get you to ask more questions about what they do in those branches when it comes to handling information, or how they access information, and of course, what kinds of assets they have in those organizations. You can have a policy around asset management at your head office, but in order to enforce it, it has to be followed up with by the local management in each of the branch offices. So this may be part of your annual compliance checking, is to check to see if people are following the policies when it comes to the handling of information or assets, making sure that they're not purchasing assets and not registering them, for instance, or not using their own personal devices. Instead, they're using corporate devices. So there's a lot of questions you might want to ask around that. Question number 4. Have you classified your network resources based on criticality or business value? The criticality of network resources is based on the type of information that's stored on it. So if you have private information, it's probably going to be more sensitive than operational information, and you may require a higher level of control. And if you have the CEO or president and his team does annual strategic planning, they may store that strategic information somewhere safe, somewhere where nobody knows where it is, and it might require a higher level of security, because strategic planning for an organization is very valuable, especially to our competitors, because if our competitors find out our strategic plans, then it's possible that they could short circuit them, right? And then we would have losses and not realize business benefits. Information assets need to have a value assigned to them, so risk management can be effective. So there's a number of different ways to assign value to an asset. Generally, finance writes off software and hardware, so they can help you in that regard with the value of software and hardware assets. But when it comes to information, it's probably a brand new thing that no one's ever taken into consideration. So you're going to have to somehow do valuation on the asset. So one of the easy ways to do that is to find out how much your competitor would pay for your client list, for instance. If it's millions of dollars, then you have your answer. Your asset list is worth millions of dollars. So that means that whatever controls you implement should help mitigate that risk, but not exceed $1 million. Some assets are considered to be tangible. So, for instance, cash, furniture, equipment, vehicles, buildings, computers, software, explicit knowledge, and stock shares. And explicit knowledge is when we write down some details about our organization. So there's 3 types of knowledge. So there's tacit. That's what we have in our minds that we don't know, but we know. So it's kind of like instincts. Implicit is when you know how to do a process and you can provide direction to somebody on how to do it, or you can carry it out yourself, then it's called implicit knowledge. However, implicit knowledge is not written down. It's still in your mind. But when you do take the implicit knowledge and you do record it so that other people can share it, then it becomes explicit knowledge, and it does have a value. Intangible assets include patents, logos, copyrights, branding, custom software, customer data, reputation, implicit knowledge, and tacit knowledge, which we just talked about. Information classification schemas could be 4-tier systems, and they might look like this. Some information is available to the public. For instance, marketing information. We place no secrecy around marketing information because we want people to share it. Operational data is a little bit more sensitive, but not as sensitive as confidential or restricted. Operational data could be the procedures or policies that we use to run our organization, but it's probably not our security standards, because security standards tell people how we configure our security. And of course, if that falls into the hands of an external user, then they could use that for bad things. Confidential information is strictly for internal use. So this is where management reports, etc., performance reports, employee files, that type of stuff is extremely confidential and sensitive. And then there's restricted. And this is a very limited group of people who see restricted information. So it's usually the chief executive officer, maybe the chief financial officer, and maybe the other executives, some senior executives on the team, plus the board of directors. Have you classified your network resources based on criticality or business value? Well, network resources can be identified as common devices, functions, features, including servers, clients, transmission, media, shared data, shared printers, and other hardware or software resources. The classification of network resources is based on the sensitivity of information. The criticality is a little bit different. So the criticality of network resources is based on a risk assessment that evaluates the impact to the organization if they lose that asset, if they lose the ability to leverage that asset to do their daily work. Service level objectives are assigned to coordinate internal departments and external service providers. Service levels are things like we expect when we have a ticket and we have a problem and we put the ticket into the system and send it to you, that you will respond within an hour. You'll pick up the ticket, you'll look at it, evaluate it, and then within 2 hours, you'll take some kind of action to resolve whatever it is. So service level objectives are very important. You want to make sure that as your program matures, that you have that integrated into your procurement exercises or service management processes. Some examples. Extreme priority 1 has a risk rating of 90 plus 1, and we'll talk about risk ratings when we do risk assessments. The service level objective is a response within 2 hours, or to be completely resolved within 2 hours. A critical event, priority 2, it's a risk rating of 80 to 89. We expect it to be resolved within 4 hours. High, priority 3, risk rating 60 to 79. It can be resolved within 10 days. So you have more time now. These higher ones are meant to give the organization time to bundle together different, action plans so that they can treat a bunch of things at once as opposed to doing it one-off. Because when you do it one-off, it's very expensive and not too many organizations are interested in doing that. So you kind of have to find a happy medium between where your organization is comfortable and where your third-party service provider is willing to go. So this provides the scale. This is a 5-scale system, and the 4th scale is medium, priority 4, and it's a risk rating of 30 to 59, so there's not much impact here. So we're willing to give whoever it is 30 days to resolve it. And finally, low is priority 5, and it's a risk rating of 0 to 29, and they have 90 days. Question 5. How do you differentiate between cybersecurity roles and responsibilities and your organization and third parties for your organization and third party and service providers? Okay, as part of cybersecurity governance roles and responsibilities, we must document those roles and responsibilities, and we must communicate them out. This is very important. Usually it starts with a job description. Part of cybersecurity governance over supplier relationships, all roles and responsibilities are documented, authorized, and coordinated by both parties. So this is a must within NIST. For example, if we have subcomponent manufacturers and they provide raw materials to our services, then they must document their roles and responsibilities. The same with any assembly plants. So if raw materials are provided to an assembly plant, then they must document their roles and responsibilities. And then if we have any physical offices, they must also document their roles and responsibilities. And then moving forward, after the product or service has been created, then we have distribution centers. We have sales and marketing teams who sell our product in retail outlets, perhaps over the counter. And finally, consumers who access or purchase those assets. They don't need their responsibilities defined, but we need to understand the roles and responsibilities around the critical path until the product is developed, until it gets to the distribution center so it can be sold. So that part we need to document. 5, continued. How do you differentiate between cybersecurity roles and responsibilities for your organization and third-party service providers? Well, we need to do an annual review to make sure that once we document it, that it stays effective, so that third parties are doing what they said they were going to do. And it needs to be included in the agreement. So when you sign the contract or when you're negotiating a contract, this is the time that you want to add these types of things. You don't want to wait until afterwards, because once the contract has been signed, most third parties will say, that's out of scope. We didn't agree to that. It wasn't part of our contract. Or they'll charge you extra for it. They'll say, oh, sure, we'll do that, and we'll send you a bill for it. So you want to make sure that you have the roles and responsibilities documented, and you want to do an annual review to make sure that the third party is following the rules. The terms of the agreement include provisions like right to audit or security assessment of external service providers to check their architecture to make sure that it's alignment with our security controls. Now, the way that this can work is we can take a couple approaches. So we can have, for instance, in this case, 4 different tiers, 4 different types of assessments that we do with our vendors, depending on the risk that they pose. So if they're truly a key part, a critical part of our products or services, then we might do a type 5. We might do a site visit and do an audit on site to make sure that they're compliant. If they're not that risky, we might actually do a type 4, and or not that critical to our process, we might do a type 4 and do a 3PE or third-party evaluation. 3PE questionnaire can also be used for type 3, but you can see in the difference is that we use 2 different types of certificates. So the SSAE 18 is actually an attestation for internal controls. It's done as part of the annual Chief Financial Officer certification. And it has to be signed off by a third party, one of the big 4 accounting firms usually. So this is really important. That's why it's a little bit lower risk, because we have another party also reviewing the controls of the environment. Whereas the ISO 27001, the organization may be certified, may not be. But we do know one thing about ISO 27001. It is the grandfather of all information security controls. And if someone is following it and applying it, the chances are they are covering off the risks that are involved with the assets. And then, of course, type 1 or type 2 weighted questionnaire. So this is a 1-page questionnaire you might send to them and ask them a bunch of questions about their security, and then they would answer that. So it's very low risk. This organization that we're doing this type of assessment for is very low risk to the organization. So it might be a printing company that prints our brochures before we send it out to customers, for instance. Now, once the evaluation is done, then we plot it within our risk rubrics cube to determine what the impact is. And if it's necessary, we'll take some sort of corrective action. We'll take the risk and we'll put it in a risk treatment plan and then monitor until it's complete. If it's not that important, then it might go on a roadmap for continual improvement. Now, practices. So in each of the lessons that I've created, I have practice statements. And although this is not a seminar and we're not sitting in person with each other, these are some things that you can do to help improve your skill transfer process. So I suggest that you create a list of assets. Ideally, you can do it in Excel, or it can be comma delimited, and you could import it into a system once you acquire a system. Or maybe you will continue to manage it in Excel. Depending on the size of your organization, that might be feasible. Some organizations, however, have thousands of assets. I know some small organizations that have 6,000 assets, and some large organizations that have over 90,000. So depending on the size of your organization and how many assets you discover, that might drive the need for automation or the use of Excel. So practice 1, create a list of assets. Practice 2, include the physical devices and the applications, telecommunications, data flows in the asset inventory. All right. And we're on to practice assets with common vulnerabilities are common as follows. These are the type of assets that you might find. We've already talked to this a little bit earlier. So we have information, people, hardware, software, and telecommunications and facilities. So when you do your asset inventory, you might come up with this list. And you might want to use this as a basis to go and gather your information. But generally, there will be more types of assets depending on what kind of organization it is that you have. Okay, test 1. Okay, which of the following are physical device assets? Are desktops physical devices? Are laptop computers physical devices? Is the Microsoft Office a physical device? How about a smartphone? What about a warehouse? Is that a physical asset? Or a laboratory or head office? How about your chief executive officer? Are they a physical asset? Let's see. Well, if you said desktops, you're correct. If you said laptops, you're also correct. Microsoft Office is software, so it's not a physical asset. It's an intellectual or analytical system. A smartphone is a physical asset, though. And that's it. Test number 2, which of the following are software application assets? Is Microsoft Word? How about a laptop computer? What about Microsoft Office? How about a smartphone? What about Excel? How about Outlook? Or what about your head office? Or what about an enterprise resource planning system? Let's see. What do you think? If you said Microsoft Word, you're correct. It's a piece of software. If you said Microsoft Office, you're right again. Laptop computer is a piece of hardware. Smartphone is a piece of hardware. But Excel is part of the productivity tools that are included in Microsoft Office. Outlook is also, it's an email system used within Microsoft Office. Head office is a physical location, but an enterprise resource planning system is, again, a piece of software. Question number 3. I can trace telecommunication data flows using the following technology. Can you do it with Traceroute, Wireshark, cloud computing? Can you use a smartphone to trace data? How about Visio? Or what about Ping? Or what about your head office or your data center? Let's see. What do you think? Traceroute. You can use Traceroute to trace packets, absolutely. And you can use Ping, yes. On to question number 4. Test. Where are external information systems located? Head office? Laptop computer? Microsoft Office? At the bank? At the warehouse? At the laboratory? In the cloud? How about the internet service provider? What do you think? Well, they could be in the warehouse. Absolutely. That would be external to your head office or your data center. They could be in a laboratory as well. This is where you assemble perhaps some products or build stuff that you're going to sell and market. Not cloud computing, not internet service provider. Test number 5. Answers. What are critical network resources? File shares, laptop computer, Microsoft Office smartphone, virtual private networks, laboratory, Outlook, or the internet. If you said file shares, yes, file shares are critical to the organization. So are VPNs or virtual private networks. And Outlook is also being able to message or communicate with other staff and coordinate work or address problems. It's very important, and Outlook is how we do that. And the internet, of course, is the backbone. Without the internet, we would not have cybersecurity because the whole reason for cybersecurity is all based on the internet. 6. Who is responsible for your organization's assets? Is it the government, executive team, human resources, corporate lawyer, my manager, service provider, law enforcement, or chief executive officer? What do you think? The executive team is responsible because they've been assigned that responsibility from the chief executive officer or your president. Human resources are responsible for some assets, mostly the human ones, because they're the group in the organization that takes care of the employees, making sure that everything's addressed, benefits, payroll, all the issues, corporate development, those types of things. Your manager is responsible for assets. Generally, your manager will assign you with a laptop or a smartphone or whatever the assets are that they share from the organization. and he'll hold you, or she will hold you, accountable for the management of that asset. And when the day comes that your job is over, then you need to hand it back to them. And ultimately, the chief executive officer is responsible for the entire organization and its assets and the management of risk in the organization. Progress chart. Okay, let's see where we are. We just started, so we are here on number 1. And as you can see, there's 23 lessons. The first 2 modules or courses have a lot of lessons. And then it gets easier as we go after that, once we get past 2. All right, lesson completed. Thank you for your time today, and I hope that you enjoyed the first lesson and that you'll sign up to the Barnard Institute for Cybersecurity and take the remaining lessons, because we have another 22 lessons waiting for you to make you an expert on this cybersecurity framework. Thank you and have a great day.